I actually have a tweet all ready to go because I was thinking ahead today. Okay. Alrighty. Yeah, so we'll just kind of hang out for a few minutes. I'm very excited to finally be reading this series. Like, I was starting to get embarrassed at how long I've owned it and not read it. So.
Oh, I've read it so much now that I sometimes am embarrassed to mark it as read again.
No, do not let people shame you for rereading. This is a rereading safe space. I'm so excited that you agreed to do this with me. I'm like really looking forward to it. I finished this book and I'm like, this series is gonna break my heart and I'm gonna love it. Like I can feel it coming. Like
yes.
In the best way.
Yes. It's like a good heartbreak. It's like a hurts good kind of thing.
Yeah. Also, speaking of which, I just realized there was one specific thing that I wanted to add to my list of things to talk about. Okay, I guess I should open it through YouTube as well. Let me mute that tab so I'm not horrified by the sound of my own voice.
That is the worst.
And especially when you're like not expecting it. Like editing videos has made me have to be a lot more okay with it, which is good, but in general, still don't love listening to myself. Okay, so I have that pulled up. Hello, welcome. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get into introductory stuff. I think there's probably going to be like a short section at the beginning that we can make spoiler free. So I'll mention to everyone reading along or watching along, in case you haven't finished the book yet, I'll try to mention when we switch into spoilers. Because there are some things I think that we can talk about without, although there's not like a ton of, like this isn't really like a plot twist kind of book. Yeah. There's like one or two things or characters that we can avoid talking about till the end, but like as we were discussing before we went live, it's like vibes. We're here for the vibes. Okay, so hello. We're going to go ahead and get started. Obviously, people might still be showing up, and thank you also if you end up watching this back later. Really appreciate that. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the first part of our Fairyland series read along. We're going to be discussing, deep breath, The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making by Catherynne M. Valente. You will have noticed that I did not even try to put the title on our thumbnails because I just didn't think that would work. But yeah, so this is the first live show. It's a 5-book series, and then we're also going to be doing a wrap-up live show at the end. I do already have the announcement for that linked in the description if you want more information about that. I also have Mari linked in the description. So would you like to introduce yourself, Marines, my wonderful co-host?
I'm Mari. My name is Marines here on YouTube. I'm also on TikTok and Twitter and Instagram under that same username as well. And I talk about books, review books online and other media as well.
Yes, and like I said, Marines is already linked in the description. She's kind of a Catherynne M. Valente expert, especially on this series. So I'm really glad that she was able to join me to host these because I have never read this series. I've read other things by this author. So I think it'll be really fun to have like one person who has never read them before and one person who like, you said you reread this almost every year, right?
Yeah, yes.
Cool. So I think, and I'm a big fan of rereading, so I think that's going to be a fun balance to have. Okay, so before we get into overall thoughts, I usually try and mention content warnings. I don't think there's a ton with this book. The only things that might come up is like some violence and like kind of imprisonment, but I don't think a lot of our discussion is going to involve those. So let's go ahead and start with our overall experience with this author and series. So I think Mari, you should go first.
Yeah. So I found this book through a real, like in real life book club that I was joining locally. It was a brand new book club, and this was the first pick. I had never heard of this book or the series. It actually was like a, I think it's called like I read YA. It was like some adults reading
Oh,
YA, like
yeah.
national book club that had a local chapter. And this was like the pick for everybody. So I was like, cool, I want to join. And I read the book and I was like, oh my God, I love this. So I ended up reading through the whole series. It took me a little while actually to read through the whole series. I don't think that the last book was out even yet when I picked up the series. And since then, I have read a bunch of Valente's other work, not all of it. I'm still missing a couple of her books, and there's one book that I have DNF'd that I don't think that I will finish. Deathless. It was a little too dark and intense for me
Yeah.
personally, but I love her work. I love her writing, and even the ones that are like even Deathless, I thought was beautifully written. And like another one that I gave like 3 or 3.5 stars, it's still really, really beautifully written. So her work is a must read to me because no matter what the end feelings are, I know that I'm going to find something just like juicy and spectacular. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said, I have never read this specific series before. It's one I have owned for an embarrassingly long time.
mhm.
So, yeah, read along is a perfect excuse to make myself read it. I actually, one of the books by Valente that I have read is Deathless, and I totally get why you DNF'd it. I really enjoyed it, but I'm really glad I was kind of prepared for it. And it's also one of those books where, like, I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars. But anytime somebody talks about why they hate it, I'm like, you're correct about everything. Like, I like can't argue with any of the negative comments about it. I also read Six Gun Snow White,
Mhm.
which is a really unusual Western Snow White retelling. That's a novella. I really enjoyed that. And also, I think probably this is the one. This might be the one that like really put her on my radar as kind of like you were saying, Mari, where it's like I don't always love her books, but I'm always glad I read them. Like there's
Mhm.
always something I really enjoy about them because I really liked the refrigerator monologues, which was a
Yes.
bunch of short stories that are like takes on superhero tropes and especially how they relate to women.
Yep.
I don't like superheroes. I don't find that interesting at all. And I really loved that collection. Actually, that
I
was a
did
buddy
too.
read with Jocelyn, who is also a Valente fangirl. So yeah, I've read like a very interesting mix of her work. Those are the three, and they're all very different. But I feel like this is probably one of her better known series.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so that's kind of been my experience. I obviously knew that you really loved this series, so I knew about it for a long time. But I don't think it's the kind of thing you can really prepare yourself for.
I try to like tell I this is another one, as you said, with like her other work that I understand why this is not for everybody. It
Yes.
it is very like I don't know. It does what it does so completely. It just very much leans into its style and its vibe. So I totally get people. It's like not for them, but this
Yeah.
is like tick 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 on things that like I love. It
Yeah.
just checks all the boxes. So
Yeah. And actually, that's a perfect segue. So let's just talk kind of generally about our overall thoughts about this book. I know it might be hard to, like, I know when you've read a series so many times, it can be hard to, like, separate specific feelings. But if you have any specific overall thoughts on this first book, and we are going to keep this non spoiler for now. Um, but yeah, just kind of overall, any kind of general thoughts and feelings about this book.
yeah, so I think that when I first read it and it was like immediate love. So some of those boxes that are just like for me, right? I love portal fantasies. I love fairy tales. And I found that this was like very much a love letter to both fairy tales and language.
Mm-hmm.
And so both of those things like together were just it was just so I don't know, it was right up my alley in terms of like all of the wit and the vibes of it all. But I really appreciated that it also had like a dark undertone. It
Yeah.
felt very much like looking at the darkness of fairy tales like right in the eyes and not shying away from it in a way that was still kind of age appropriate to middle grade. Like it wasn't like gratuitously violent or dark, but it like had that like undercurrent of darkness throughout it that I thought was just absolutely lovely. So Yeah, I loved it from the beginning. I love this for all of the characters and the found family aspect, and like, very much love travel journeys as well, where you're going from place to place and like picking up experiences and life lessons and people as you go. So the more and more I read, I was like, oh my God, this is everything I love in one little book. And
Yeah,
so,
personally written for your enjoyment.
yes.
Um, yeah, I also love books that deal with fairy tales and that communicate that kind of darkness to them, especially when it can be something that is still very age appropriate. Actually, the read along I just finished doing with Frances Harding's books, that is one of the things that she does and that I love about her work. So that was kind of one of my favorite things about this book as well. Um, yeah, I love the way it deals with fairy tales. I also ended up really loving the characters. As I said, I can feel the heartbreak that is coming, but it feels like it's done very intentionally. Like I feel like I haven't read enough of Valente's books to say this definitively, but she's kind of shaping up to be just like one of those authors where like I trust her, like I trust her not to do things just to shock the reader. I trust her for her choices to matter and to feel right for the story. And that's what I care about more than like, oh, I hope this specific thing happens, because I think that's what makes certain plot twists or character, plot lines or deaths or whatever like disappointing, is when it doesn't feel earned, or it feels like you can see the author like manipulating it so that you can just have a specific feeling.
Yeah.
um yeah, I am not a fan of travel books, so the fact that I enjoyed this one I think is pretty impressive. Like I'm a hard sell on a journey story, but some of my favorite moments were still some of the different like locations that she went to. Like we'd
Yes.
have another stretch of like getting to another place, and I was like, okay, like we already did this, but then that would be like one of my favorite scenes. So I feel like she won me over. I also love Catherynne and Valente's writing. I do think this book for me was a little more on the purple prose side, just
Yeah.
because I can be kind of picky about flowery language. But even though there were chunks of this book where it felt a little bit overdone, again, there were those moments where I'm like, oh, this is such a perfect like line, or like the atmosphere or the moment. So like even the parts that I think I'm gonna like enjoy even more in later books, like she ended up winning me over. And I also ended up really loving the characters, and that actually really carried me through some of those pieces where like I wasn't as interested in this part of the journey, or I feel like the writing was a little like overdone. Like I already love these characters so much that I'm like, all right, I'm just along for the ride. I'm here to
Yeah.
have a good time.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And like speaking of characters, do we want to talk about September
Yes.
as a protagonist? Let's get into it.
I love her so much. I will say that on first read, I remember thinking that like the supporting characters outshined her.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of like, she was like a fine protagonist to me. Like I liked her, but I was like dazzled by A through L and by,
Yeah.
there's a freaking lamp that makes me cry. There's like all of these
Yeah.
characters or whatnot
Yeah.
that I thought were just like so, um, that were brighter than she was. But through reread, like, and because I have the benefit of like the full series now,
Yeah.
she's just become one of my favorite protagonists of all time. And I think that her journey really is so central to the story, like her internal journey, right? Because we're watching this external journey that she's going on, but so much thematically is about her own growth, like emotionally and growing up, and just she's experiencing a lot of things, like a lot of heartbreak and a lot of emotions and a lot of life lessons that she's going through, and so she becomes the heart of that for the story itself. But she's also just got all of these personality traits too that are just like impossible not to root for. She's our little like engineer, right? She's our little the way that she's almost self-aware of being in a story, and she's thinking like,
Yes.
how will I act in my adventure kind of thing. Like all of
Yes.
those things really make her easy to root for. And I love her so much.
Yes. Yes. We have some more love for the lamp.
Yeah.
Yeah. I That was a very emotional scene. Yeah, I had a very much the same experience with September, just reading this for the first time, because I I loved A through L almost immediately. I loved Saturday almost immediately. And in comparison, it took me a little while to warm up to September. But by about the middle of the book, pretty much at the point where, I don't know, maybe it was like the second or third selfless thing that she did.
Yes.
Where I was like, okay, I'm like really invested in you now. I feel like the narrator kept telling us, like, you know, she's like a little bit heartless, like
Yes.
children are, and she isn't. And seeing her realize that she isn't and that she can't be, and that sometimes she wants to be, but she's like, I'm always going to make the choice to help somebody, even if I don't know what's going to happen. I love that in a protagonist. I have a weakness for those characters who like don't think of themselves necessarily as being a hero or being like, even though, as you said, September is very aware of the fact that she's like the protagonist of a fairy tale, I don't think she thinks of herself as this like great and good person, you know, this very selfless person. But like, even though she's cranky and even though she's a little grumpy, she really is like, every time she has a big choice, she will always pick the thing that helps people. And I
Yeah.
love that. And I really admire when authors can write a good guy character like that and still make them so interesting, and can still show like all of this like conflict. Like, you don't have to have an anti-hero to have good internal conflict.
Yeah.
I like that she's kind of a stinker. Yeah. Happy, well-behaved kids don't need to go on fairy tale adventures. Yeah, I love that she's kind of a brat, but she's
Yeah.
like a very good-hearted brat, and I love that.
So I think thematically, it's really interesting that you know, the whole thing is that, like, right, children don't have hearts, children are kind of heartless, and that's what makes them able to go on these grand adventures, right? You have to be a little bit heartless to take that step or whatnot. But throughout, we're really exploring, not like, it's like positioning it as like she's growing a heart, but really what we're seeing is that, like, if she's experiencing all of these emotions, she obviously has a heart, she's very selfless at moments, and it's almost Fairyland that you learn doesn't have a heart. Like, Fairyland is a dark place, and
Yeah,
Fairyland is doing a lot of things like solely for you know, the story, right? We're stealing children, we're bringing them here, like whatever
yeah,
else is going on in Fairyland. Like, Fairyland is the dark place. So seeing that like flip flopped and explored through the series, but through this book as well, I think is one of my favorite themes. Is just sort of that, but also, like, you know, the sort of selfishness that is inherent in having an adventure and in prioritizing yourself. And, you know, that first moment where she decides to leave behind what is a very gray and dull existence for her. Her father is fighting a war, her mother's off at work, and, you know, she's washing the dishes when the green wind comes to collect her. And so to have like the selfishness to be like, yes, I am going to go on an adventure, I'm not even going to look back and say goodbye. That's the kind of heartlessness that is put forward about her. But the more that you learn about her, you're like, okay, no, she did this selfish thing in being here, but she's actually a girl with a really big heart. So
yes. And we definitely see that with the way the ending plays out as well, which we will get to later. Not late at all, Amy. We're just kind of getting started. Yes, Jellybean says Fairyland probably needs her as much as she needs it. Yeah, and I think there's this really interesting feeling of, I don't know if there's a word for like a negative symbiotic relationship, but that's kind of what it feels like. Like
yes,
Fairyland, like you were saying, Muddy, like it needs these kids to exist as a story, and like it like rips them out of their own world. And a lot of times we see that, you know, the kids choose to go, and it's not a terribly exciting life they come from, but it's still very like it still like feeds off of them.
yes,
And I think it's really interesting seeing that balance, like that I don't know, like reciprocal need. I really wish there was a word for like, you know,
yeah,
negative symbiosis. Yeah, when a whole world is kind of a parasite. That is kind of what it feels like. And
yes,
going back to what we were saying near the beginning, is like I really like that kind of like fairy tale surface, and then you look underneath and it's like, okay, well, what would all of this actually mean? Like, what would it mean if someone lived in a world like this? Like, what would it mean if you had to like kidnap children to exist as like a kingdom?
yeah.
um yeah, I really liked
I
that.
also like I'm a like traditionally good hero type of girly. Like I really struggle sometimes with like the focus on morally great characters and how that
Yes.
often, kind of swings to excusing really bad
Yeah.
behavior and messages specifically, not behavior, because you can have bad people doing bad things, but it's when it gets like romanticized and like
Mhm.
there's messages that like are like forget that this is a bad person doing bad things that it really starts to bother me. But I do love when we have like a traditionally good hero that has like a big negative quality. So like September reminds me a lot of Lyra from Philip Pullman's The
Mhm.
Golden Compass, where like Lyra is this like good she's this kid, traditionally good hero role. She's a liar, right? And that's her
Yeah.
thing throughout. But it becomes like her strength at one point. Like she lies herself through some like really difficult situation. She becomes Lyra Silvertongue, right? And that's how I feel about September too. Is like okay, she's here. She's this good hero character, but she's a little bit heartless. But in some moments, you see that that is what like it becomes a strength for her because she gets to go on this adventure. She's brave enough to do certain things and like to
Yeah.
embark on them because she kind of uses that like big flaw in a way. And I love that setup so much.
Yeah. And she's kind of finding like the limits of her own heartlessness
Yes.
throughout this book. Like she's kind of like realizing like, okay, I'm not actually selfish in these circumstances. Like even her selfishness, she turns into helping other people. Like she kind of has that one big selfish choice, which is to go off to Fairyland, which I think the way her life is set up, it's very understandable.
Yeah.
But not only do we see that she does eventually miss home and miss her family, and kind of miss where she came from, but like when she gets to this other world that like basically the characters even tell her, maybe it's A through L, I don't remember who tells her, but they're like, well, you could just choose to have a good time here. Like nobody is going to make you like take up the sword and go and fight like the Marquess and all of this. And
Mhm.
September's like, yeah, but I can't. Like I can't just like ignore what's happening. And I love that about her. I love that she like weaponizes her selfishness and her stubbornness to actually be such a good person.
This is
Um,
not the last time too that we will see throughout the series that Fairyland or some characters like ascribe a negative characteristic to her and say you are this, and then she's like, kind of like, am I? Like, and then she's like,
yeah,
well, I mean, and then she like almost owns it and like turns it into like a positive thing. And it's so it's like a recurring thing where like people keep trying to tell her that she's like this bad thing. And then
yeah,
she's like, actually, I'm like
yeah,
I'm gonna use it for good kind of thing. And it's so good for like a young female character to like take that.
yeah, yeah. And I love like the number of times where she does something very impulsive to like help somebody, and everyone's like, you can't just do that. And she's like, I just did though. Like, what are you gonna do about it? Um, Macklin says, and she gets a few opportunities to go home and she doesn't. Yeah. And I just really love that like the particular kind of selfishness that September exhibits, especially near the beginning, is maybe it's because like that's the kind I hopefully I'm not like a selfish person in general, but specifically the kind of choice that she makes, that's the kind of thing I could see myself doing if I had these kind of opportunities. So maybe that's why I find it more forgivable. But I do really love that it's not the kind of selfishness that makes her like an unpleasant character to follow, or that makes her like not want to help people or take care of people. Um,
I
it's a
think
very
that
very Fairyland specific selfishness that I like.
I mean, I think that ultimately what it's saying a lot about growing up and that there
Yes.
is like a bit of selfishness to growing up because you do have to leave. You have to leave your
Yeah.
house, the people you love, and you have to prioritize yourself. And I mean, that is just part of growing up is that you have to start to make decisions for yourself and for what you want and for your own good. And so it's like labeled like selfishness in this book, but what really we're going through is a growing up journey for September. And so, her
Yeah.
making decisions for herself.
One of my favorite themes to see middle grade explore is like the bittersweetness of growing up
Yes.
and growing older, and like
Yes.
that just gets me in my heart every single time. Even the like way that the heartlessness thing is phrased, it reminded me so much of that line in Peter Pan. which has many issues, but I do love the way it talks about like childhood and refusing to grow up and all of that. And there's that line that's like something about all children being innocent and heartless. And like that just makes me think so much of this book and of September. And I'm already having a lot of feelings, and this is only the first book. So
Just
we'll
you
see.
wait.
I know. So speaking of having a lot of feelings, we can talk about some of our side characters. A through L, the Wiverary. I just keep calling him L in my head because September is correctly like, that's kind of a lot to say every time. Can I just call you L? Yeah. So our sweet little library wyvern hybrid. How do we feel?
I love A through L so much.
Yeah.
If this whole book and series is like a love letter to fairy tales and language, then L stands in very much as like a like love letter to knowledge and to libraries, right? And so he's just such a great companion to have on this journey. And like you said, immediately just in love with him. I also think that he stands in very much for the kind of whimsy that you find in this book that also makes it like not for everyone. And it's just like just because magic. And you see even September like questioning it, where he's like, okay, oh my I don't know, I can't remember which way it is. My mom fell in love with a library or whichever, you know, and then September's like, and he's like, it is what it is, you know, like the kind of magic that is here. Like it is what it is, right? Very much whimsy just because magic, but it works so well in this character, and I just love him so much.
I love those characters that are, especially like fairy tale creatures that are like giant and dangerous, but like the sweetest little cinnamon roll. Like, I love him so much. And like, I love too how I love his and September's friendship, and even like their meeting. I love that it's such a good moment to see again September's kindness, even underneath her like snarkiness and brattiness. Like when he's telling her the story about his mother falling in love with the library, and like September's thinking like, I don't know that that's actually true, but she's like, I can't tell him. Like, I'm not going to tell him. I love him so much. Yeah, I think his grandfather is like the big library.
Yes.
I think that's what Elle was thinking. And it's the kind of story where it's like, this could be true. I don't know. Like, maybe.
And then you're like, even you as a reader, you're like, I don't think that's the way that it works either. But I mean, anything you ask him to reference, he's like, boop, boop, boop.
Like it's plausible in this book. Yes, he is the best boy. I love him so much. When he like, this is a very, very minor spoiler, so I'm going to still count this as non-spoiler, but go ahead and mute this for a couple minutes if you like to. But like when he gets to fly again, I just loved it. Loved it so much. Okay. Tiny spoiler section over. Let's see. Let's talk about Saturday. Yeah, very similarly, it's like, second we meet him, I was like, I love you and I will protect you and nothing bad better ever happen to you. So
yeah, it's hard for me to talk about Saturday too within the confines of this book, because I feel like Saturday's like arc and everything about Saturday happens like from this moment on. We get to see him as a character shine so much more. But you know, with both A through L and Saturday, we find them in really sad situations, right? And like, they both are kind of imprisoned in some way. One at the end, and when we meet A through L or whatnot. So they've got their own like very, very like sad pieces going on. So it's another thing that just immediately it helps, because you meet them and you're like, oh, my heart goes out immediately to these characters. So yeah, I love Saturday so much. I love Saturday so much. But I think that a lot of that is like yet to come. So
I know, I can like feel, it's like I already love him so much, and I'm like, I can already feel that this is just the beginning and I'm gonna be crying. Like I can feel the approaching heartbreak, and I'm ready. Amy is so glad we get more Saturday. Yeah, he's such an interesting character. Like his backstory is so interesting. The kind of like magical being he's so interesting, and he kind of reminds me of Eeyore. where he's like just so sad that you like, I love you already without knowing anything about you, and then every time we see him in another scene, I like loved him more. um yeah, the wrestling scene at the end was really good, really interesting.
Excellent. Yes. I like
Yeah.
that between the three of them, and they're kind of like the core, the heart of our like little group or whatnot. It's such a good balance between characters too, because you have Saturday, who is a little bit more even and a little bit more, like you said, like he's got like a darker tone to him a little bit, and then you have Adruel up here, who's just like a ball of energy and light and love and whatnot. So balancing out like the two of them, September, I think that that trio, it just works so well together.
Yes, I loved their little friend group so much. Saturday and the Velocipedes, I think that is what they are. How he makes sure they don't hurt them. Yeah, the Velocipedes were. Remind me of which ones those were. There were like a couple of.
The bicycles.
Oh yes, the Velocipedes. Okay, I was like, I remember this one. Yeah, yeah, I
Yes.
really like the way that he was the one who stopped them from like. I think they were going to like whip
With
them, or
them,
yeah,
yes.
like he was like
And then
an
he was like,
obvious.
these ones will take this. And then they're like, how'd you, and he was just like, I asked.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
the velocipedes. Yes, great visuals. Thank you. Yeah. I couldn't remember what they were called because like I remember that scene very specifically and I didn't remember the name for them. Um, okay, so I think this is probably going to be the end of our spoiler-free section. So if you haven't yet finished, just so you know, we are going to get into spoilers. And let's see, where do we want to go from here? If we want to stay on characters for a minute, the Marquess is super interesting. She is obviously the antagonist of the story. I think she also is pretty clearly set up as like a foil or kind of like a counter example almost to like September's experience. So let's just like talk about her. What do you think about the Marquess, like in general? And then I have like a couple specific questions.
Yeah. Um, I like her as a foil to September. She's one of those, like, I'm not a villain girly at all.
Yeah.
He is, so it makes it even more like impressive or whatnot when I come across one where like my heart does eventually go out to them. And I
Yeah.
did have a moment where I was like, again, I don't know that Fairyland is the real villain here, but I feel like Fairyland has like a lot of the fault for the things that happen because of like that dark undertone, and it's like single-minded sort of pursuit of like the story at all costs. And in a lot of ways the Marquess feels like she's like she's part of the cost, right, of what happens in Fairyland. So she was like very like typical villain for me as I was reading or whatnot. I was like, yeah, bad
Yeah.
character.
Yeah.
But then towards the end, I was like, "Oh no, you're not making me feel things for her." Like, "Oh
Yeah.
no."
Yeah. Once again, I had a very similar experience. Like she's obviously not a good person. And then we get to the end, and I feel like it was actually a good example of how you can get context for a villain without trying
Yes,
to excuse what they did.
exactly.
Because my heart did hurt for her. I was like,
Yeah,
this is a horrible situation to be in. I don't know how you would handle that. Like, obviously, she chose like a terrible way to try to do that, but
yeah.
it's not, there's not like a good answer, like an easy solution to it. I also wanted to ask how you feel about her as a character, like in the context of like this book being about like growing up, partly like the fact that she's immortally looking like a child, and how that's very different from her experience. So if you had like any things you wanted to talk about with that.
Um, I think that like the whole thing of her like being stuck here, like immortally being or looking like a child, really speaks to that, like her inability to like let this go and
Mm-hmm.
to like move on and to end the story or whatnot. So I think the visual of like keeping her as a child especially like we see her kind of stagnant, right, in that like childhood, forever a child, and we see September on such a pronounced journey and
Yeah.
like doing so much growing up against her foil, who is like forever in ringlets and whatnot. But also, I think there's a lot there. Just seeing her throw tantrums and whatnot, like throughout, that is like, I don't know, it like captures, I think, a lot of the frustration of childhood and of like, puts it in a person that it has and is wielding a lot of power. But there is something about like the way that she behaves and like throws tantrums and things that I'm like, yeah, that's a forever child.
Yeah. And it's weird because she has grown up and now she like so she has those memories and that experience, but the way that she acts is not always like she does.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting too, like kind of going along with you can see her point, even if she's horrible, when
Mm-hmm.
she wants September to end the travel between worlds forever.
Mm-hmm.
Like you can see why, because of what happened to the Marquess, why she would view this as a good thing. And there are even parts of it that maybe seem like a good idea because it's like we've said, the way that Fairyland will like take these children and kind of like feed off of them. And it's like, yes, they do, like the kids do get to choose that, but like how much of a choice is that really?
Is it
Like
informed consent?
exactly. It's like, do they really have all of the facts here? Not really. So there are parts of that that can almost feel like a good idea, but then there's also this feeling which September picks up on immediately, and I think the reader does too. There's this feeling of like, well, but that doesn't feel right either. Like stopping everybody from getting to make that decision. It's like it's kind of another symptom of the Marquess being not able to grow up and not able to change is she just wants nobody to have these choices and to have those made for them, whereas September is kind of more like people should, like, even though Fairyland is dangerous and even though she is scared some of the time that she's there, she's like, I'm not going to say that nobody else can have this, like I don't know if I was like if I had a conclusion there. I just thought that was like really interesting, the way that like the Marquess's end goal is something that can almost seem like a good idea, but September knows it's not, because it's kind of more of the same. It's like choosing, like somebody else choosing what's going to happen to these kids. It's just going to be the
Right,
Marquess instead of Fairyland.
right. Another like something to look forward to in the series is that we hear more about, and again, it's like in a way that is like adding context and it's not recoloring or trying to excuse the Marques's behavior. It just is more and more context, especially in a way that it's talking about like power, because she's
Mhm.
ruling Fairyland, for a while. And so you really get to see like maybe there were parts of this where she did a good job, right? And
Yeah.
she was enacting some of these rules and things that like people didn't like, but they were still order, they were still rules in a way that like the thread of that continues. And so I think it's really interesting to think about that in the context of like people in power in general, and sort of
Mhm.
that thing of like, okay, uh, it, where are the lines between like somebody in power doing a good or a bad job, or like seeing their point but taking
Yeah.
the worst possible route in order to like get to that point. And so she's a very, very interesting and dynamic character, and just like an excellent foil to September, like really just like almost copy paste of a character, but you see them taking two totally different routes.
Yeah. And I like that you see that every time they have a conversation, is like they had very, in some ways, very similar circumstances, but they chose opposite things at basically every opportunity.
Yeah.
Um, Talking about the Marquess, Amy said it felt very childhood traumas extending into adulthood if you don't work through it. Yes, I agree. Um, yeah, the stumbled and the changelings. That's a good point. So not all of the kids who end up in Fairyland get even a semblance of a choice about it.
Yeah.
I feel like the big difference between September and the Marquess is choice. September chooses to go to Fairyland, and the Marquess does not. Yeah, and then it's interesting too because they sort of they enact that upon other people as well. So the Marquess did not get a choice, and so her response is to not let anyone else choose at all. Like she's like, well, I'm going to protect them from what happened to me, but the way she does that is by also taking away these kids' choices about anything. Yeah, she's a super interesting character as well. I also am like the older I get and the more I read, the like less of a fan I am of the villain thing and like
Mm,
anti-heroes and all of that. So I feel like the Marquess is like an example for me of a really well-written antagonist where I find her interesting enough that I don't hate reading her scenes, but
yes.
I also feel like we get good context for her that's not trying to excuse what she does, or like it's like, oh, everything was a misunderstanding, she's actually good or something like that. um let's see. Okay, we've talked about this a little bit already, but there's a lot to say about the writing and the atmosphere. So we did talk about how, like, I love the way that you described this as a love letter to fairy tales and language. I think that is a perfect description for this book. I think that's also one of the things that makes it a very particular kind of book and a very particular flavor. And like I said at the beginning, I do think there were places where it felt a little much for me, but even though I had those places, by that point I like loved these characters so much, and there were also enough lines and scenes and moments that totally worked for me where I feel like the writing was perfect, that I'm like, I'm not that mad about it, it's fine. And I feel
Yeah.
like also as the series goes on, I think I'm going to adjust to her writing. um, in this specific series, I think I'm going to adjust to that even more. So I don't know if we had like specific writing or atmosphere. This also might be a good chance to talk about some specific scenes that we have. We'll do quotations at the end, but like any particular like moments or settings, like there are a lot of really great settings here. And since it is like a journey book, there's a lot of like stopping at different interesting places. So that's a lot. Any direction you want to go with those.
So I'll talk a little bit about the writing first. This was like the correct amount of like purple prose, like for me in particular. I feel like the thing that like makes it good for me is that it feels like it is lyricism and it is descriptive, and it is like wordy with a purpose.
Mhm.
And because like you come away with it with such a clear picture of like I can see it is vibrant, it is bright, it is atmospheric. So all of those words are doing something.
Yeah.
And often, even when it is wordy, it is like turns of phrases. There's a lot of wit there. There's a lot of humor. So everything felt purposeful enough that it like was like thick and juicy for a reason. Where I
Yeah.
go astray with like purple prose, if it's just like stringing together words and like one, you're losing meaning, and two, like for why? Why do we need all of these extra words? Where I feel like Valente says has a good answer for why. So the writing just does it for me here, from the super long titles and chapter titles,
Yeah. I
to
love chapter
like
titles.
all the way down through. I just think it's so whimsical. And the other thing that I love about it is that it is very earnest as well, which is I think part of why what turns people off is that it's not only whimsical, but it is earnest, right? And there are bits of it that are just like that feel like, like very cheesy, like life lessons and quotable
Yeah.
quotes kind of thing, which totally get why that would turn people off. But I just want to eat them. I want to
Yeah.
post. They would be on my AIM, like my AOL away message, if that were the time. That would just be quotes from this book because I just
Yeah.
love them. But they are like super earnest, and they can be a little like cheesy and like the life lesson that it's trying to give. But it all worked really, really well for me. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And something else, because like I'm very similar, where one of the things that will turn me off really flowery writing is when I feel like it's for no reason. And another thing that will often get me, probably I think the what most often makes me irritated with the writing style is when I feel like the descriptions like obscure characters and they like overshadow the story to the point where it's like, yeah, these words sound good together, but they don't do anything. Like I don't know who these people are. I don't care about like this setting. Like it's not really contributing to the story, and especially when that comes at the expense of characterization. And I think one of the reasons why I got along well with this book, even though there were places where I feel like the writing was a little too much for me personally, is you still saw the characters through that. Like she didn't like bury them under all these like adjectives and adverbs, and it's like, yeah, this sounds pretty, but I have no idea what's going on. Like I really appreciate that we still got such a clear sense of September and A through L and Saturday. And like the lamp, we're talking about like the way that she still let the characters shine even
Yes.
amongst all of these really long descriptions, and I really like that. um, Amy shared a quote. September read often and liked it best when words did not pretend to be simple, but put on their full armor and rode out with colors flying. Yes.
That is
Yeah.
like the whole, that's what the series is doing.
Yes.
All the
Yeah.
colors flying, yeah. I think that it goes along with, we'll talk scenes too, because I have ones that I want to mention, but I think it goes along with the writing. I absolutely love the way that the narrator is used in the series, like sort of
Mm-hmm.
the omniscient narrator. And I think what kind of softens some of the like life lessons or what, it keeps it from being preachy a little bit to me, is that the narrator is directing it at September and not to us, the reader. And so we're getting to see the narrator being like, September should know this, but like you and I are in and so it like created that layer of us being on one side and kind of like, sharing that. And so it didn't feel super preachy, right? All of these
Yeah.
like lines about growing up or whatever, they're directed to September. I love the way that the narrator becomes is its own character, right? She's
Yeah.
talking to us, she's leading us through the story, she's trying to guide or at least, kind of interact with September in a way that it was just absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. I think another thing for me that kept it from feeling like too over the top is that I feel like September's knowledge that she's in a fairy tale, like the self-awareness of
Mhm.
her and of the book, for some reason that also added like an extra layer of distance to me. Like even though the book is very earnest and genuine about what it's doing, the fact that September knows that and like comments on it, and she'll like reason based on, she's like, all right, well, this is a fairy tale, so obviously I'm not going to do this because that would be stupid. Like I love that. And I think that like cut some of the like really intense whimsy, like
Mhm.
it added this practicality to it that I
Yes.
really, really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Um, yes, the series filled up a bathtub of metaphor and dove right in.
Okay,
Yes.
speaking of bathtubs, I think
Yes.
my favorite scene in like maybe this whole book is with the soap golem.
Yes.
Uh,
I loved her.
I love that scene so freaking much. And I think that it really hit me because it was like a timing thing, when a book just like lands at the right time. So I don't think that I had ever really thought about like resetting your dreams. And so like, reading about like how you have to scrub up your dreams and like, to like take on a new journey, like really, really impacted me in terms of like checking in with myself and seeing like, do these dreams and goals and aspirations still serve me? And is this something that I need to scrub up my courage and my dreams? And like, is that something that I need to refresh? So that just like that was like a life lesson that I took away from this. I was like, yeah, I should check in with myself more
Yeah.
often. But also it was just such like a touching scene, so beautiful. I love the soap golem so much.
Yeah.
And I think it might be my favorite scene in the whole thing.
Yeah, that was one of the ones that I specifically was like, oh, this is an example of like the writing and the whimsy and the setting and all of these things that can sometimes feel like a little much. It was not too much. It was perfect. Like I loved that. I think the part that especially resonated for me was the part with her courage specifically.
Yeah.
And like I feel like there's been a little more awareness lately about like not just like self-care as like empty words, but it's like when you're, for one thing, just like existing in the world as it is right now, but also like anything that you're struggling with or dealing with, it's not just like, oh, I should take care of myself because that'll like make me feel good. It's like it is a necessity if you're going to keep doing anything. And I like that like September was forced to like relax and kind of like take care of herself. And like it
Yeah.
was like, especially connecting that with bravery and like with
Yes.
courage, is like
Yes.
you must take time to yourself. You must do things that are good for you and that bring you joy. And that is not selfish. Like that is like a necessity for just being alive. Like I just really, really liked that. And I thought that was like a really nice way of kind of, I guess this is another way that it is a love letter to fairy tales or to adventure stories, is like that moment when the characters have been like, you know, trekking through the woods and they're all dirty and exhausted and like they haven't slept on a real bed in like 3 months or whatever. And that moment of relief where it's like, oh, we got to the inn or whatever. Like, I like that this was such an extreme version of that.
Yes.
So yeah, it worked on multiple levels.
For sure.
Yeah, it was like emotionally cathartic and also like literally a relief when it's like you've had a really like awful stressful day and it's like at least I get to take a shower at the end of it.
I love it.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and just talk about other specific scenes while we are on the subject. And we do have like a space at the end for quotes, so if you want to save any for that you can. Like I basically am gonna make everyone listen to like 2 long paragraphs of describing autumn because I loved that. Love that so much. But yeah, like any specific scenes we wanted to talk about. The other ones for me were just when she first meets the Marquess. I thought that was like the dialogue was so good and like that feeling of things are off here and I don't know what they are, but they are. Mm-hmm. And then also that confrontation with her at the end and just the way that like yeah, just like the way that explained so much about the story. And yeah, again, like I really like the dialogue of this book. And I think that's another thing that sometimes if an author does too much of the flowery writing, dialogue can sometimes suffer. And I feel like it didn't here. So yeah.
I really like when she's building a ship of her own making. I love that entire sequence. I think it is also kind of a heartbreaking part to see her like, you know, putting this whole thing together, using her own clothes as a sail, like tying it up with her hair. It is another like huge moment of like sacrifice. Another big theme throughout we will continue to see is that like September keeps assembling this little ragtag group, and she is also constantly having to also like do things alone. There's always a moment in the story where September just has to go it alone. And this was her moment where she's like, you know, all by herself and she has to figure out a way. There was also something about like her having to like take off her clothes and be like totally exposed and like I don't know, it made you feel how much she is exposed in that moment and how like much she's in danger and how much she's sacrificing to like get to her friends at the end of the world or whatnot. So that entire sequence is like one of my favorites as well.
Yeah, I also like the making part of the ship out of her own hair or like fishing with her own hair. Like that's just the symbolism is so good. Yes. We have some Iago appreciation in the comments. I loved it. I was like, I know you're like the bad guy animal, but I love you and I hope nothing bad happens to you. I feel like he also is a very like specifically fairy tale feeling character because it's like you don't really know whose side he's on. He's not really on anyone's side, but like I don't know.
Like
there's
a cat thing, like big cat energy is. Like...
I loved that. And there's like so often in like stories that kind of draw on like fairy tales or adventure stories like this, there's so often that like one character that's like technically aligned with the villain, but it's like you know that there's going to be that one moment where they like help the main character. I also wanted to pet Yoko. Like bite my hand off, but I'd be like, what a cute kitty. I would not last in Fairyland, I think. I just want to pet the cats. Like
you'd be bitten.
I would. Loyalty among villains, yeah. Yeah, I think most of the other specific scenes or moments are quote sections, but I also really enjoyed the chapter titles.
Yep. The illustrations by Anna Juan.
Yes.
Love them so much.
Yeah, I really liked that. He was sassy and I loved it. He sure was. Also, in terms of the themes, we talked about this a lot with the Marquess, but I don't know if we had any other thoughts on like the way that choice fits into adventure and into life. And there's even a moment where like September explicitly compares her talking to the witches where she's like, I'm gonna go get back your spoon, like I'll go do that, versus the Marquess who's like forcing her to do something. So I don't know if we had I don't know, specific things we wanted to say about that, but I just thought that was also a really interesting kind of like focus, you know, throughout this book. I'm sure it's
Yeah.
going to come in a lot in later books, but
There were a couple moments we talked about with the bicycles where, Saturday just asked them, can you like can you take us? But also with the witches where September is like, you could have just asked me to get your spoon. You didn't have to dazzle at me to try and
yeah,
get me to do it. And the witches are like, oh, like, so there are a lot of little moments where it talks a lot about like, choice and like consent and like,
oh,
that whole thing throughout her journey. So I appreciate those moments as well.
yeah. Okay, I think those are most of the main things. The only other thing before we get into talking about the ending specifically, um, is I just was really struck by the comparing setting of Fairyland versus home, and the way that we see that like at the beginning September, like we find out she's a little bit heartless because she doesn't really think about home, she doesn't really care, or at least she doesn't care enough to make her regret going with um is it the green
The
wind?
green wind, yeah.
Green wind. I wanted to say the north wind. I'm like, no, that's like Greek mythology or something. um so yeah, I just really love that. I love when fantasy books can like balance those things, that feeling of being like safe and like comforted at home, and then that feeling of like adventure and like trying to have both. And when we get into the ending we'll talk about this more, but I thought that ending was perfect, the way it
Yes.
like balanced those two things. Like I loved that so much. So I don't know if we wanted to talk anymore just like in general thematic terms about like Fairyland and home, but I really loved that. It felt so natural, and like seeing how like when September did feel homesick, it felt like it made sense. Like because she wasn't always thinking about it. She was also having a great time, but then she also started missing her mom, and I thought that was like really lovely. So
Yeah. Yeah. I also love, part of what September is struggling with is that her father is off fighting this unnamed war.
mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of fear for her around that, but her mother's in the workforce, right? And so, like, she's spending less time with her mom and things are hard at home or whatnot. But then to get to the end of the story and see her mom play such a big role in that, specifically, and what like it has taught September and what her sword ends up being because
Yes.
of her mom, like all of that tie-in, I'm just like, oh no, I gotta call my mom.
Yes. Yeah. I love that so much. Yeah, so let's talk about the ending. I think this is one of my favorite. Like, it's such a hard balance to strike at the end of a like portal fantasy. Like, you have to make me believe the character's choice, you know, whether that is to stay or to go back. Like, there's just, I feel like there's so many ways that authors can get it wrong, in my opinion. They can make it feel like cheap, like if the character doesn't have to make a choice, or they can, I feel like sometimes they try and get out of it by like it was all a dream, which I hate.
Yes.
I hate that trope so much. So I feel like this specific kind of ending where it's like you have to choose if you're going to stay or go home. That is something that when it's done well, I love it. It just gets me in my feelings, and it's like my favorite thing ever. But if you do it wrong, I will like bitch about it forever. Like I really, really have very strong feelings about that like plot device. And
Yeah.
I think this is one of the best ones I have ever read. Also, the fact that we brought in like the Persephone story, I love that.
Yeah.
Like, and the way that works with like the fairy food, and how like
Mhm.
September gets both, and how that feels so perfect, but there is still a cost to it. I just am really in my feelings about it. So, would
Yes.
you like to share your feelings about it?
Again, we will continue to see throughout the series, and this is why I love the series, and it has one of my favorite endings of all time because of the way that Catherynne and Valente balances like both and like
Mm-hmm.
getting both, but the cost to like sort of having your cake and eating it too isn't like all
Yeah.
it's cracked up to be. And
Yeah.
like the balance between home and adventure, and how do you strike that balance, and how much is too much and how much is too little or whatnot. So yeah, I think that even from the beginning, though, you have a sense as a reader that, like, of course Fairyland is not forever. uh
Yeah.
just because, as readers, we know, right? That's the kind of thing with the portal fantasy, is that you end up coming back out. So for a story that doesn't have a very strong plot core, it's just kind of like bouncing around in vibes. I think having that very strong and sudden beginning, like you open it and it's like the green wind is like, come on. And
Yeah.
then that very like clear and distinct, like going back home ending, it makes it really satisfying. So
Yeah. And I love, like you were saying, I love the way that September's mother comes into that at the end. Um, yeah, I love like the way that she like comes home and her mom's there.
yes.
Um, I love the way that the ending fits into, like, we know that September is like one of like the ravished, and like what that means for the rules of Fairyland, and we've been hearing throughout like what the catch is for all of that, and we don't know what her catch is. And
Yes.
then the fact that the last chapter is called Ravished means you cannot stay. It just like, I love it. I love being sad.
Yes. This reminded
um
me too, you talking about the green wind reminded me of my like another one of my favorite sequences is when he first takes her, and she's trying to ask him why her, and she asks him like four questions back to back,
yeah,
and he's answering her but giving her different answers or whatnot, and finally she just breaks down and she's like, I just want to know if I'm special, like, did you pick me?
yeah,
Oh my God, my heart.
yeah.
Such a good moment.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a great example of how, even though this is such a high whimsy series, there are these moments that feel so human and so relatable, because, like, of course, September wants to know that. Like, I think anybody would want to know that. We all would want to know if we did end up in this kind of situation. Like, we'd want to know if we were special or not.
And I
Um,
honestly feel like throughout this, the answer is yes and no. She's like,
yes.
she is just a girl from Nebraska or whatnot. But she's special. And,
Yeah.
her mom gave her this one specific ability and key, right? That
Yeah.
only she could have pulled that sword or whatnot. So there are things
Yeah.
about her that are clearly unique and special, but also she's just a girl growing up. So like
Yeah.
the answer is both, really.
Yeah. And I love the way that the answer being both like, I have the feeling throughout this whole book, like, of course we love September, and we love the specific strengths she has, and like the sword that she pulls because of her mother. I love all of that, but I also get the feeling that this book is not doing something that really irritates me. It's almost like a corollary to the like not like other girls thing. It's like, you don't have to make you don't tell me that like no other girl could have done this. Like, you don't need to do that to make me love this girl. And I
Yeah.
feel like that, like, having the answer both ways, just the whole time I had this feeling that like we are following September and her story, and I love that, but I don't feel like we're supposed to think that every other girl who ever came to Fairyland couldn't have done these things.
Yes.
But like, they could have, and they're both still special.
Yes.
I love that.
Exactly.
um Amy said, so relieved that it wasn't a dream. I was braced for that disappointment at the end and was pleasantly surprised. I think this is an example of me trusting Catherynne M. Valente, because I don't know that I was even worried about that. A lot of times I do worry about that, and I don't think it occurred to me this time, because I was like, she wouldn't do that to us. I also enjoyed that she felt average at the beginning and learned her worth and importance while adventuring through Fairyland. Yes. And my special part broke my heart. Yeah, that might have also been around the time where I was like, all right, September, I love you too. Like,
And you're perfect in every way.
yes, yes. Um, okay, yeah. Anything else you want to talk about with the ending? That, I guess, like, it would kind of count as plot twist, but like the thing that we find out from Saturday, which, like, I normally hate that trope. I hate it. But I did not hate it here. I was like, oh my God, the drama. And obviously we do know, like, I've heard this from people, and I think it also just makes sense with the themes of this series. It's like, that she's going to grow up as the books go on, and I'm like, It's going to make for some angst later. Oh boy.
In more ways than one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Everything you were thinking in that moment of like squirt, like rewind that back. September is also thinking. So trust
Yes.
Catherynne M Valente to like bring it back around and be like, wait, run that back again.
I'm sorry, what just happened? Yeah. Probably like one of the biggest plot twists in a book that is not about plot at all. The only plot is this twist.
Yes.
Should we jump into quotes now?
Yes, I don't. I'm like looking through mine.
There were references to dreaming in the book, so I was worried. Yeah,
That is
this is
true.
my first Valente, so I had no clue what to expect from her. Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah, so if we want to share any quotes or any other like specific scenes we wanted to talk about, I think the only one I've talked about this in other read-alongs. I am not a good quote saver at all.
Mm.
Like I will read a line I love and I'm like, nice, and then I don't do anything with it, and then I'm like, why didn't I do anything with that? So the only one I actually have saved is that section about autumn. So I can share that after you share a few of yours, Marty.
Okay. We were just talking about this, so I'll read this one out to everybody, but it like sums up what we have said. So it goes, you chose to face your own death, not to balk at a great sea to cross and no ship to cross it in. And twice now you have chosen not to go home when you might have, if only you abandon your friends. You are not the chosen one, September. Fairyland did not choose you. You chose yourself.
Also sums up basically everything I love about September, and I also love a non-chosen one story. That is one of my
Yes.
favorite things. Yeah.
She chose herself.
Yep.
Let's see. There was also, okay, this is the one from the soap column scene, but this is like the quote that I think of all the time. So it says, for the wishes of one's old life wither and shrivel like old leaves if they are not replaced with new wishes when the world changes. And the world always changes. Wishes get slimy and their colors fade, and soon they are just mud, like all the rest of the mud, and not wishes at all, but regrets.
Yeah. One. I'm gonna read. This is like 2 whole paragraphs, so sorry everyone, but here we go. This is when she gets to like that autumn place, which I love.
Mhm.
Also, living in California, I don't see a lot of real autumn, so this was just very special for me. I suppose you think you know what autumn looks like. Even if you live in the Los Angeles dreamed of by September schoolmates, you have surely seen postcards and photographs of the kind of autumn I mean. The trees go all red and blazing orange and gold, and wood fires burn at night so that everything smells of crisp branches. The world rolls about delightedly in a heap of cider and candy and apples and pumpkins, and cold stars rush by through wispy, ragged clouds, past a moon like a bony knee. You have, no doubt, experienced a Halloween or two. Autumn in Fairyland is all of that, of course. You would never feel cheated by the colors of a Fairyland forest or the morbidity of the Fairyland moon. And the Halloween masks, oh, how they glitter, how they curl, how their beaks and jaws hook and barb. But to wander through autumn in Fairyland is to look into a murky pool, seeing only a hazy reflection of the autumn province's eternal fall. And human autumn is but a cast-off photograph of that reflecting pool, half burnt and drifting through the space between us and Fairyland.
Beautiful.
Yes, I love it. And also like that imagery of like the reflection. That's something I love that. I love like in fairy tales where it talks about like this but more, you know? I
Yes,
love that
yes.
so much. Like the
I'm
essence of
so,
autumn.
I'm so excited for you to keep reading now. I keep wanting to be like, well, wait, just you wait.
Yeah.
I will say, I think maybe the first one is my favorite in the series. The second one is a close second. But I have a feeling it's just my favorite because it is the first one. It is like the one I
Yeah.
fell in love with. It's the
Yeah.
one I've reread the most. So I will be very curious, like at the end of this all, like your ranking in terms of the book.
Yeah.
But there's absolutely still so much juiciness to come. So I'm very excited.
I am very excited as well. Any other quotes you want to share or anything else we want to talk about that I haven't covered? I think that's pretty much everything. that I
Yep.
had.
I don't have anything else. I don't think. I'm sure after we end, I'll be like, "Oh man, I should have said
Oh wait, yeah.
this."
That's okay. That's what the wrap up live show is for.
Yes, that's true. I'll make a note.
Yes. And so speaking of upcoming live shows, our next one is going to be on Marina's channel. Again, she is linked in the description. We don't have a date for that one yet, but the second book is, you probably know the title by heart. What is the second book?
The girl who fell beneath Fairyland and led the revels there.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I like really put you on the spot there. Like,
I
no.
blanked for one hot second, but I got
Yeah.
it.
So that is going to be our next discussion. Yeah, it's going to be on Mari's channel. She's going to be like leading that discussion. So I can't wait to keep going with this series. I'm so glad I'm finally reading it. Yeah, thank you guys who are already reading along with us or who watched this back. And I can't think, is there anything else we need to cover or?
I think that's it.
All right. So we will see you guys in about a month. We'll see. Who knows? Yeah, thanks for like reading along with us.
Thanks for joining, guys.
Yes. And broadcast.